SleepApnea.org presents Portraits Living with Sleep Apnea, a conversation with Dr. Michael Grandner. What drew you to sleep research?
Who knew there was a job where all you could do was talk and think and learn about sleep all day? I've always been interested in understanding things that have lots of layers to them. And so at first I was very interested in studying dreams and how dreams worked in the brain and all that stuff. And then in college, I didn't realize, but we had a sleep lab on campus that I could volunteer at. Not knowing that what sleep research was, I worked there for a couple of years in Michael Perlis's lab and really learned about the field and about how there was this great story of sleep research that began a long time ago, picked up speed in the 50s and 60s, and had all these great characters and themes and stories, and I just really wanted to be part of that story.
Discuss treating sleep like diet.
So a lot of people who are psychologists in sleep were psychologists who became interested in sleep. I was a sleep person who psychology was my way into sleep. So I'm very interested in this whole idea of the real world and how do you bridge what we do in the lab in such a way that it actually impacts actual people out of the lab. So how do we understand how people live their actual life and what they can actually do in a reasonable way that can promote sleep and help people get the sleep that they need to be healthy. Sleep, in my mind, is a lot like diet, where it impacts all these different areas of the body, but it's complicated. And even though you're meeting a biological need, it's not like breathing where you're meeting it passively. You're meeting it by engaging in all kinds of behaviors. And these behaviors are socially determined, culturally determined, behaviorally determined based on your beliefs and your attitudes and your schedules and all these sorts of things. And so whether or not people are getting healthy sleep is based on all of these things that they're not necessarily medical. And so if we're going to help people sleep better, the solution is probably not a pill, at least none that we've been able to find so far. The solution is probably going to be the same as it is for diet. It's how do you eat healthier in a way that actually makes sense and people can actually do. And so the same thing with sleep. How do you get people to sleep healthier in a way that actually makes sense in people's lives, in a way that they can actually do? And what does that do? That's a behavioral and cognitive thing. Just like obesity isn't really a disorder of metabolic hormones, it's a disorder of choices. And it's a disorder of attitudes and beliefs and behaviors and accumulated things that happen over time. Sleep problems, I think, are the same. So the thing about sleep is it's a great equalizer. Everybody needs sleep, just like diet in that way too. Everybody needs sleep pretty much every day for pretty much the same amount of time. And because of that, sleep problems affect everybody. So I have patients that I see who, have more money than I will ever see in my life, and they're still not sleeping well. And I have patients who are struggling with multiple jobs, trying to take care of all these responsibilities and never having enough resources, who are also not sleeping. What's fascinating is, as much as sleep is a great equalizer, the causes of the sleep problems across all these different walks of life are shockingly similar. They all have to do with time. No one feels like they have enough time in our society. A lot of times we see sleep as unproductive time, and what's more un-American than unproductive time? So, um, there's lots of people struggling to find time because we're trying to do everything. And whether we're the CEO of a corporation or we're trying to manage kids and taking care of parents and also multiple jobs and all this sort of stuff, at the end of the day, a lot of it's about time. And we've come to a point, I think, where people are starting to recognize, you know what, sleep is actually something worth doing something about. Or maybe 10 years ago, or maybe even longer, sleep problems were something that people didn't seek help for because it wasn't seen as important. Like, as long as I can wake up in the morning, get to work, and come home, I don't have a problem. And I think a lot of people still feel that way, but I think people are starting to realize that sleep isn't necessarily just an expense of time, it's an investment in your own health and in your own productivity and your own efficiency. And if you're not sleeping well, it actually does impact all these things, and it's worth fixing. Now it's so exciting because people are talking about sleep in a different way. The conversation about sleep on the ground, in the public, in news articles, in the health space, in other fields of health and medicine, the conversation about sleep is changing. People are starting to recognize that sleep is important. And this has given some attention to this idea of being able to measure sleep in the real world using all kinds of different technological approaches. Sometimes it's movement-based, sometimes it's heart rate-based, sometimes it's based on other things. But it's great and has lots of potential. What I'm most excited about is where this is going. So the more ubiquitous we can make some of this measurement, the more passive we can make it, the more accurate it can be because it'll capture real life. We can get precise measurements of sleep in a laboratory, but just because they're precise doesn't mean they're accurate. It doesn't mean it's reflecting how people are actually sleeping when they don't have wires all stuck to their head. So if we can track people over time with some degree of detail, that's great. And right now the conversation seems to be focused on the issue that if we can measure it, we can change it. And I think that's a product of there not being enough behavioral people in the space because a behaviorist will tell you a bathroom scale is not a weight loss program. Just because you can measure something doesn't mean you're changing it. For some people, just getting feedback is enough, but for most people it's not, especially long term. But what this does is this opens up the opportunity to have the information we need to provide the feedback that will actually help people in their own homes, in their own real life. If we can integrate some of this measurement into the background of people's lives, we can make a real impact. So the great thing about sleep, it's like diet in a lot of ways, but it's actually easier to measure. Because you're unconscious when it happens, we can have objective techniques and even subjective techniques like sleep diaries that actually work shockingly well in getting a really good picture of how someone's sleeping. So sleep is easier to measure than diet. It's way easier to change than diet. That's also the behavioral space. So a lot of people don't realize that not only is sleep easier to change than diet and exercise and can help improve those things too, but all the people out there who aren't sleeping, they think the best answer is probably some sort of medication that will help them fall asleep faster. But what a lot of people don't realize is actually most medical organizations now recognize that the behavioral techniques for fixing insomnia are actually preferred over medications, not only because they don't have the side effects, but they actually work better. You can actually retrain your brain to sleep. You can potty train your brain so that it knows, it's a learning process, that it sleeps in bed when it's supposed to. And it's way easier to do that than to train yourself how to eat better. We can use this technology in a way to advance health through learning how to implement the technology around behavior change.
Address applying research to real life.
What's the point in measuring something if you can't do anything about it? Sometimes you want to measure it just to get a red flag, but I think the reason most people are wanting to track their sleep is because they want to optimize it. And maybe step one is treating a disorder like an insomnia disorder or sleep apnea. Step two would then be getting your sleep healthy. And then step three would be, okay, you're okay, how do you be better? And the great thing with sleep is you can do all of those things. I'm really excited for the future about moving beyond that.
Tell us about the waking benefits to better sleeping.
One of the things that bothers people about lack of sleep isn't that they're dissatisfied with their sleep. They are. But what brings them into the clinic is that they're dissatisfied with their waking experience. They're dissatisfied with how alert they are, with how focused they are, with their productivity, with their irritability, with their relationships, with all these things. At the end of the day, it's our waking life that will spur us to behavior. Just like pain is what brings people into the doctor's office, no matter what disease you have. Into the sleep clinic, what'll bring you in is the problems that you're having during the day. And that's where I think that our potential is. If we can help people live their lives better. I work with a lot of high performers, like whether it's athletes or business people, whatever. And one of the things I say is like, look, I know you say you don't have time for sleep. So let's say I've got an athlete in front of me. And I say, okay, what if I had a routine for you that could massively improve your performance and your efficiency? Would you do it? Yes. Okay, now what if I told you, if you did it, the main side effects you're going to see realistically are your mental performance is going to improve. So if you're a student athlete, your grades are going to go up, or if you're a pro athlete, you'll just see your performance increase. All your relationships will get better. Your mental health will improve. You'll be better able to manage your weight because this whole sleep and weight thing is huge. Those are the main side effects you're gonna see. If I had something that could do all this for you, would you do it? I say, well, of course. I said, well, I bet you'd do it if it cost money. Because then, you got something invested. But because sleep is free and you just have to make the time for it, bet you could make the time for it if it cost you something. But if it doesn't cost you anything, people have a hard time making time for it. But that's the perspective I think people need to take. Not that sleep is a cost, but sleep is an investment. You got to spend money to make money, right? And you have to invest in yourself, or else you're not going to get the rewards in yourself you're going to expect.
Discuss addressing more than just disorder.
One thing I'm particularly worried about is that there's so much of a focus on sleep disorders that the perspective of sleep health gets lost, where sleep disorders are very important. They affect a lot of people. They're underdiagnosed. There's really good reasons to invest in them. But I don't think they're the only part of sleep that needs to be invested in. Because a lot of the money might be in funding research on disease versus funding research on health. The money is in devices that treat disease, not so much devices that promote health. I mean, there are some, and there is some stuff there, but it's when you have a conversation about sleep, a lot of times it drifts to diagnosing and treating sleep disorders only. And as I mentioned before, I think that's step one. Step one is you deal with the disorders. Step two is you get to a point where you're at least healthy. And then step three is you optimize. But there are those two other steps. I think we get so focused on the first one, we lose perspective that, yes, there's a large portion of the population that has these disorders, but there's a larger portion of the population that doesn't, that can still benefit. And there's so many more people we can help. There's so much more good we can do in terms of societal benefit. So that's one thing that troubles me. The other thing that's troubling me is that in the healthcare space, the sleep field has focused almost exclusively on a single diagnostic test for a single disorder. And sleep is so much bigger than that. Overnight sleep testing for sleep apnea is not something to build and grow a field on. It's one test for one disorder. It's a great test for a very important disorder. It strangely dominates pretty much any conversation about sleep medicine. Well, what about everything else? And there's such a bigger picture of sleep health that this is just a piece of. I don't want to minimize it, but I don't want to make that the only thing we can ever talk about. I think, you know, no field of medicine can build itself on one diagnostic test for one disorder that essentially doesn't change, and that's a problem. The third thing that I get troubled by in the field is because sleep is a great equalizer, and because sleep is something that everybody does, at least in the behavioral space, there's a real lack of um, an ability to enforce standards. So you have people out there who are selling services which sound a whole lot like behavioral diagnosis and treatment of sleep problems with little to no training in sleep at all, with little to no credentials or even experience that would count besides just the fact that they've done it, but they haven't learned from anything besides from reading some book. And sleep is kind of complicated, and you only really know that when you dive into it and you get good training. And so the lack of training pipelines has created a demand that hasn't been met by supply of trainees. And so that demand is being met by people who are often unqualified. They might be great advocates, and they might have huge opportunity to do good, especially if they were qualified, but either they don't know how to get the training or it's not available to them, so they do it anyway. And there's nothing to stop them from doing that. I worry about a lot of people who are providing services that are very close to diagnosing and treating disorders that really should require more expertise, where people don't have proper accreditation. So people make up an accrediting body that doesn't actually have any credibility. They slap a seal on their website, and all of a sudden they're legit. They're not. They have no training. They made it up. And so people who have the training look on that and say, what are you doing? You don't know what you're doing. You have the potential to hurt people here without meaning to, even if you're well-meaning. So anyway, I'm worried about this issue of a lack of standardization in credentials, at least on the behavioral side. The medical side's done a better job of this. On the device side, there needs to be standards in terms of what a device can claim and what does it take to make that claim. But in sleep, especially insomnia, people get right up to that line and in my opinion, cross that line a lot of the times where you have devices and technology approaches to essentially diagnosing and treating insomnia disorder, which is a disorder, without necessarily going through the clinical trials needed to know if what they're doing is actually safe and effective. And that troubles me because I want to do good for people. I get in clinic all the time. People who should have come into clinic years ago, but they say, I tried this other stuff and it didn't work. Therefore, only a pill is probably going to work. And I say, no, you tried a bunch of stuff that I could tell you from the beginning wasn't going to work. And now you've inoculated yourself against actually something that works because you're so discouraged now. We need to do better about that.
Explain the ideas behind taking insomnia seriously.
It used to be that people generally saw insomnia as a symptom. And if you had something else like depression or PTSD or pain or anything else, and you also couldn't sleep, you would treat that other thing, assuming the insomnia goes away. And we've known for decades now that actually that doesn't work, that insomnia takes on a life of its own. And I think providers have been a little more willing to say, okay, this is a legitimate issue. They've been a little more willing to see the evidence, where in the past, if you even look at some of the textbooks, they don't talk about insomnia treatment very much. And so it's not the provider's fault that they're not educated enough. For some reason, it doesn't find its way into training. It's starting to. It's not that I'm getting more referrals, it's that I'm getting referrals a little earlier. Where, like, okay, I'm treating your depression, you also have insomnia. I'm not going to wait till I'm convinced that your depression is all fixed and your insomnia is still here before I send you to the insomnia person. I see people of all age ranges. I have people as young as late teens who have insomnia. They usually require a little more prodding, where what's interesting is they might be more likely to complain of sleep problems, but might be less likely to want to do something about it. And I have a lot of older people who are coming in because they feel out of control. Also, the other thing that I think is changing this is the athletic space. I think as people are reading more and more about pro athletes who are taking their sleep seriously for their performance, I think it helps reduce the stigma of dealing with sleep problems. Where, look, high-powered people have sleep problems. Instead of it being an inevitability, they're actually doing something about it. Maybe I should do something about it. And people are more willing to do something about healthy sleep if they see other people who they see as successful take this issue seriously as well.
Regarding insomnia, address how attitudes are changing.
There are some communities of varying strength for various sleep disorders. There's some communities built around sleep apnea and on great online forums and stuff. There's some communities built around narcolepsy. There's some communities built around restless legs. You see very little about sleep health and insomnia. Insomnia being the most common sleep disorder. I wonder why. I have some guesses. I think there's a lot of people with insomnia who don't identify themselves as an insomnia patient, as like, this is a chronic disease and this is who I am. I think there's a subset of people who do, where I just have insomnia. Whether you have the insomnia or not, you identify yourself as like, I'm just an insomniac. But I think a lot of people see insomnia as that symptom, or as temporary, or as a personal failing. It used to be people would brag about how little sleep they get, because that was a sign of, if sleep was restorative, and if you could function fine on less restoration, it was a sign of strength. It meant you weren't as debilitated. You could recover faster. That was a good thing. And now I think the conversations change, where we don't necessarily brag about how little sleep we need. I think we more likely brag about how busy and important we are that we don't have time. So cancer survivors, I mean, aside from cancer itself, but cancer survivors often have extreme levels of fatigue and insomnia. And for some odd reason, the cancer literature is only catching wind of the idea that there's actually quite a bit of data on sleep in cancer survivors that not only show that there's problems, But this is a group that doesn't necessarily want to take extra medications, especially medications that might have risks that might interfere with other health issues going on. There's actually a really robust literature on non-medication treatments for fatigue and insomnia in cancer survivors that show that it's as effective or even more so than non-cancer survivors. It's fixable. It's a fixable problem. It's an addressable problem. And you don't have to suffer in silence. You don't have to just go to the doctor and be like, yeah, well, this is a normal part of the disorder and this is a normal part of being a cancer survivor. It might be, but it doesn't mean it's inevitable, and it doesn't mean it's not addressable.
Visit sleepapnea.org now to learn more.